Hello, I'm David Tickner, the Chief Executive of the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest episode of 60 Voices, a special podcast that we launched to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship. In this series, we'll be sharing the fascinating stories and personal reflections of former civil servants as they look back on their careers and the impact they had on the nation. 60 Voices aims to conserve and preserve these important work memories. So from the challenges they face to the memorable moments that define their work, each episode offers a unique personal insight into the history of the UK civil service and the people who work within it and shaped it. So whether you're a former colleague or someone interested in public service, join us as we explore the voices behind decades of dedication, service and legacy. For this episode, we are particularly delighted to welcome Lord Butler. While he served as Cabinet Secretary and head of the Home Civil Service from 1988 to 1998, the CSRF was also lucky enough to have him as its national president during that time. Now a member of the House of Lords, he also very kindly showed his support of the CSRF's Diamond Anniversary by attending a recent event we held there as part of our celebrations. As a civil servant, he served Prime Ministers Edward Heath, Harold Wilson, Margaret Thatcher, John Major and Tony Blair. And in retirement, he's been just as busy becoming Master of University College, Oxford, and also taking on roles at HSBC and the Royal Academy of Music, not to mention the small matter of the day job in the House of Lords. So without further ado, we say a big welcome to Lord Butler. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, David. Delighted to join you.
Good.
What a good idea it is.
We're going to start with a very easy question. And again, please correct me if my research has gone awry, but I believe you began your career in the civil service at the Treasury in 1961. And I also believe you later went on to serve as private secretary to the financial secretary and the secretary to the budget committee early on in your career. But I suppose as a starting point, which we always ask the new people in our episodes, what motivated you, firstly, to join the civil service, and secondly, specifically to pick the HM Treasury?
Well, I come from a Lancastrian family. My mother's father, my grandfather, founded a company called Leyland Paints, which you still see shops of Leyland Paints, but it's not owned by the family anymore. And my father didn't want me to go into Leyland Paints because by that time there were too many members of the family in it, and he aspired to that I should go into the professions, and he wanted me to be a lawyer. He made the mistake of taking me along to the law courts, and we went in to see a case where it was a contested divorce case, which one had in those days, and the barrister was cross-examining the wife, who was and taking to bits various allegations she was making about her husband. And it repelled me because for him it was a job which he was doing very courteously and professionally, but for her it was her life. And I felt I didn't want to use my intellect in that way. And I was idealist. I was attracted by public service. I wanted to do something that affected the world that I was growing up into. And also I was very competitive. And there was a civil service exam. Yeah. And I liked the idea of an exam.
And where did you go? May I call you Robin? Is that all right?
Oh, of course you
Yeah. Where did you go, Robin, to sit the exam? I mean, did you have to go all the way down to London from Lancaster, or did you?
No, we were living outside London. My father's job was to be the London manager of the paint firm.
Ah, right, okay.
And we lived at Harrow, and so I only had to go into London. And it was, I think I'm right in saying that the Civil Service Commission's office where they did the interviewing was in Savile Row. I may be mistaken about that, but
I think you're quite right. I think one of the other people we interviewed said that they went to Savile Row for their exam. So I think you're on point with that. So I think that's completely. And do you remember? I mean, how long did you have to wait after sitting the exam to be told you've been successful?
I think it was a very short time, and funnily enough, I was talking to a young man last night who was just joining the civil service and saying what a long time the process takes. I think, I'm not absolutely sure I'm right, but really the whole thing only took about a month. And so I knew really quite quickly that I got it. It was some time before they published the lists, but I think I was told that I'd been successful.
And when you went through that process, was it with the intention of going into the Treasury at the time, or did you do a general entry to the civil service, and once you'd passed the entry exam, you could then be tracked in the direction that you particularly wanted to go? Or was it?
It was a generic entry, but it was as I say, a competitive exam where they published an order in which you had passed.
Yeah.
And the higher you were in the order, the more likely you were to get your choice of department. Now, I really knew very little about the civil service and very little about government, as did, I think, most of the people who took the civil service exam. The Treasury, I was attracted to the Treasury, but also so were others, because, of course, money is the center of everything. And so you knew you would have a very wide interest span. And I remember, my second choice was the Department of Education, because having just been in education, I thought I knew something about it. And my third choice was the Home Office. Anyway, I passed in high enough to get my first choice, which was the Treasury.
And do you remember your first day? How that went?
I remember it very well. My office was on the top floor of Richmond Terrace, now the Department of Health, looking out over the Ministry of Defence. And so typically of the Treasury, my predecessor had left the job already. He'd been posted on. And my principal, I was an assistant principal, my principal had an office to himself, which he didn't want to share with me. So I went into this room, and there was a desk and an in tray with envelopes in it, unopened. And my job, I was in what was called CF division, Commonwealth and Finance. And my job was approving requests from the Foreign Office and the Commonwealth Relations Office to spend money. So I opened some of these envelopes, and there they were, asking to spend money on this and that. I remember one of them was from the Foreign Office to buy a new boat for the Sultan of Muscat and Oman.
Wow. And was that an approved purchase or not?
I think there's some sort of sweetener. Anyway, I went down. I didn't quite know what to do about these. So I went down and knocked on the door of my boss, my principal, and said, "What should I do with these letters?" And he said, "Will you answer them?" So I said, "Well, what shall I say in answering them?" He said, "Well, you'll say no." So I said, "No, but what happens if they're a good idea?" He said, "Oh, well, then they'll come back to me, and I'll decide whether to approve them or not." And so I said, "Well, what sort of arguments should I use in saying no?" And he looked rather pityingly at me, and he said, "But haven't you got a degree at Oxford? Well, you should be able to think of arguments why you should say no." And with that, he sent me off.
So it was a bit of learning on the job then, literally.
It certainly was that. I was plunged right straight into it, yeah.
And obviously you enjoyed the Treasury, because you spent quite some time in that particular department at the beginning of your career. And I mentioned in the earlier question about getting up to being private secretary. I mean, was that what was the time frame? I mean, you very obviously wanted to be successful, wanted to, achieve whatever, move up the ladder, so to speak. But I guess being a private secretary was a good starting point, was it, when you were given that responsibility?
Well, I mean, the pattern, the Treasury pattern, it may have been general in the civil service, which you did 2 years in 2 separate divisions of the Treasury. My first was, as I say, in Commonwealth and Foreign Office expenditure. Next one was Department of Trade, Department of Industry expenditure. But then the third year, you always went into a private office.
Yeah.
If you either were the third junior secretary in the Chancellor of the Exchequer's office, or you were the principal secretary in the office of one of the junior ministers. And the latter happened to me, and I went into the private office of the financial secretary. And the financial secretary at the time was a Conservative called Alan Green, but it was just coming up to the 1964 general election. And I was only with Alan Green for a month, but it was an interesting month because it was the month of the general election. And then Labour won, and his successor came in, who was a man called Neil McDermott, who was been a lawyer and very charming man and very easy to work with.
And from there, where did you go after that experience? What was the next step on the path, so to speak?
Well, the next thing that happened was that I was sent off to the Treasury Centre for Administrative Studies to learn about economics. Now, it was always rather odd that people went into the Treasury, in my case, having studied ancient Rome and ancient Greece, not much about economics. So we went off to be taught economics at the college, which was in Regent's Park, 5 Cambridge Gate, overlooking Regent's Park. And there, I went in with my contemporaries, people who joined from all the departments. And so as a group, it was a 6-month course, as I recall, I really got to know them very well. And we remained friends among our contemporaries for the rest of my time in the civil service. We all went up in our different departments. But that was a great asset because, I knew from long ago, right from the beginning, the people who were rising up the civil service with me.
Yeah. And when you completed that part of your career progression, you presumably then went back in at a different part of the Treasury, did you, in terms of what you were responsible for from a day-to-day point of view?
Well, the next thing the Treasury did with me was to second me to the Bank of England.
Is this when you were working with Lord Rothschild?
No.
All right.
That was later.
A bit later.
Yeah, I did 6 months in the Bank of England. And again, this was to allow me to see at first hand what went on in the city. The bank organised a programme where I was sent around to discount houses and clearing banks and merchant banks and so on. I wasn't allowed actually to do anything. It was really just observing what they did. But again, it made me more knowledgeable about the way in which the financial world worked. And I came back from that, and then shortly after that, I was appointed a principal.
Yeah. And in terms of, for those people listening, I mean, the principal is a senior civil servant, or is it grade level, or what? I mean, in the ranking structure of the civil service, where does that sit?
Well, again, thank goodness it was a long time ago. It was the civil service was very class organized. So there was the administrative class,
yeah,
which you went straight into if you were in the fast stream, and the executive class, which was executive officers, where people, had very often come in directly from school, either as clerical officers, and then they were promoted to executive officers. Now, if you were good, you got from the executive officers into the administrative class.
Yeah.
The people who went into the fast stream had, as it were, a running start.
But presumably, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, a lot of observation has been made about how things have changed in terms of that element of the civil service. I mean, we've spoken to people in these series of interviews who've come from all sorts of different walks of life and have all sort of found it an interesting route to where they started to where they ended up. I mean, I guess from your observing from outside looking in now, you must be quite pleased that the playing field is considerably more level, perhaps, than it was when you entered the service some years ago.
Yes, and I think it's now much more open to opportunity.
Yeah.
People make their own careers. I never really did that. Things just happened to me. I mean, I think, it was still the relics of the war, and the civil service had got a lot of similarities to the military. We actually use the words, you were posted to a job.
Yeah.
and you did what you were told to do. I mean, you didn't have any personal choice, really. I can't remember ever exercising any personal choice. I just went where I was told to go.
But you were going in the right direction, Robin, because obviously as you were building all of this experience and gaining more understanding about how the systems worked, how the whole the relationship between the civil service and government and all of those, I mean, I guess that the amount of knowledge that you were acquiring as you were going through was becoming more and more sizable, which I guess is why you were being given more and more responsibility as you got further into your career. So
Yes.
So after the Bank of England, where you then went back to the Treasury, did you? Where after your
I did, and I was in. This is when first of all, I was in something in the Treasury. Actually, come to think of it, was just before I went to the Bank of England, called Public Income and Outlay (PIO) division,
right,
and this was the division that sort of drew together all the figures for the annual budget, and
that was very interesting.
Carried with it being secretary of the Budget Committee.
Yeah.
And the Budget Committee was a committee that was chaired by the permanent secretary. It had the principal economic advisors, and then the second permanent secretaries, public expenditure and tax and so on, and also the chairman of Customs and Excise, the chairman of Inland Revenue. And we did the job. They did the job. I just kept the record of drawing together the annual budget each year, which was the Treasury's big occasion,
big day. Yes, absolutely.
And of course, highly secret. And I remember, having my first moral dilemmas about when I knew that whiskey duty was going up, whether I should buy myself a bottle before budget day.
I mean, it must be fascinating, though, to see all of the inner workings. I mean, a lot of people, obviously, from the outside looking in, you hear the headlines, you see the things on the news on a very small level, it's a top level element, but all of the things that go behind that, which is where the civil service is terrifically good as that machine. It is the machinery of government. I mean, it is all of the people working collectively to deliver on what the particular policies are that the government of the day. But it must be very for you as you were progressing in your career, being given all of these opportunities to see the inner workings of all of these things. Must have been a very interesting experience from you. I mean, as you were going through, were you crafting a direction as to where you would like to end up? I mean, we know where you ended up in the civil service, but at that point, had you thought, obviously it's a career for life, I will continue to do what I'm doing and see where I end up? Or were you gradually formulating, I would like to get to the top job and be cabinet secretary and head of the Home Civil Service?
No, I was just taking as it comes. As I say, it was like an army career. You were posted and these things happened to you. But what I hope that I've described illustrates is the Treasury was extremely good at giving one a very wide experience, very wide grounding, particularly in the way that the Treasury worked, but also from the point of view of putting the spending budget of the government together, an acquaintance with all the departments, and particularly the departments that I'd happened to be shadowing, first of all, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and it was then called the Board of Trade.
Yeah. But I believe you're as well as that, you also had some involvement as you moved through, not just in finance, but also in computerized finance, did you not? You were involved in the implementation of the computerized financial systems, I believe, in the 70s, were you not?
Yes, I was, but that was a little bit later, and we've hopped a bit.
Sorry, we'll hop back.
You mentioned that I worked with Lord Rothschild.
I did, yes. Can you elaborate?
And this was still while I was a principal.
Yeah.
And when the Conservative government came in 1970, the Heath government, they set up this thing called the think tank in the Cabinet Office. His full name was the Central Policy Review Staff. And the idea of the Central Policy Review Staff was that it was an ideas generator for the government. And it was to, as Lord Rothschild described it, to think the unthinkable and give ideas to the cabinet which challenged the government, challenged accepted ways of doing things, challenged departments. And Lord Rothschild was appointed to head that. And he'd heard of me. I can't quite remember how. But anyway, I got sufficient reputation by that I was seconded to the Central Policy Review staff. And very memorably, I remember it was the days when you did sort of critical diagrams, critical budget flows, and all that sort of thing. And I remember that I shared a room on the top of the Cabinet Office with William Waldegrave, who
yes, that's a name that rings familiar.
Yeah, although he eventually became a Conservative cabinet minister, as you know, but he was rather younger than me, but very brilliant. He'd got a fellowship at All Souls, and a memorable thing was he came from a very noble family, and his sister, Sue, who was a lady in waiting at Buckingham Palace, rang up and William was out of the room, and I answered the phone and said, as one did in those days, "Waldegrave's telephone, Butler speaking." Sue said to her family at the weekend, "This also is an incredible place. William's only been in it a week or so.
He's already got a Butler."
Telephone. Anyway, I mean, that was an extraordinary experience, and that I had to make a presentation to the Heath cabinet about how they were doing in relation to their manifesto. We did it at Chequers. We had huge boards that illustrated in blue what they were achieving and red what had been in their manifesto, and they weren't making any headway with. And so, as what was I, about a 34-year-old then, I had to make this presentation. This brought me to the notice of Ted Heath, and when a vacancy came in number 10 in the summer of 1972, as one of the private secretaries, I went in there as the private secretary dealing with parliamentary questions and parliamentary correspondence.
That must have been amazing. I mean, did you feel at that point I've arrived? I mean, when you were actually attached to the Prime Minister of the day, you must have got to there must be a certain amount of pride there to think, well, I wasn't anticipating a career in the civil service, but look where I am at the tender age of, in my 30s, I'm private secretary to the Prime Minister.
I didn't. Well, I don't remember feeling pride. I remember feeling pretty scared, and also rather in awe of Ted Heath, who he wasn't a very easy person to deal with. He was very loyal and he was idealistic, but he had no small talk, and and he looked at you with a sort of glaze over his eyes. But every few weeks, the glaze suddenly cleared, and he looked at you as if he liked you and even needed you. And I found that very winning.
That is always good to know where someone stands, I think, on an issue. But did you get any tips or advice when you got that particular role? Was there anyone on hand to say, "Robin, you need to keep this in mind when you go and do this job"? Or were you literally, you are now the private secretary to the Prime Minister, this is where you need to be at 9 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning or wherever it may be, away you go and make it work?
No, my mentor was the principal private secretary of the Prime Minister. There were 5 of us who were in the private office.
Mm-hmm.
And the principal private secretary then was Robert Armstrong, who of course was eventually my predecessor as civil service. And so he was my mentor. He was the one who gave me my instructions and who led the whole team. And 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's office, was very different from what it is today. Because, first of all, it was much smaller. As I say, there were 5 private secretaries. There was then also a press office, and there was a patronage secretary and there was an honours secretariat, which were all part of the office. But then there was only a very small political element. There was the Prime Minister's parliamentary private secretary and a political secretary or two, but it was the political element was very much smaller, and it was definitely the civil servants, and in particular the principal private secretary, Robert Armstrong, who were in charge of the whole thing and who ran it. But the job was to give balanced advice to the Prime Minister, balanced advice and help, partly from the civil service and the links to the government, and partly the political staff who were the links to the party.
The CSRF, the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship, is a charity set up for civil servants by civil servants. In 1960, Douglas Houghton MP highlighted the need for an organisation that supported retired civil servants offering friendship and companionship. 59 years later, we are still carrying on his dream. You can find out more about the CSRF at our website, www.csrf.org.uk. Why not sign up to become a digital donor for £3, less than the price of coffee? Or you may wish to volunteer. Contact us via the website.
And what form did that advice take? Was it a written opinion, or was it? Were you giving lots of briefing notes, or was it verbal, or was it a mixture of the two in terms of how that was transmitted?
Well, the job I started with was briefing the Prime Minister for parliamentary questions, PM's questions, which in those days were both on Tuesday and Thursday, not just one day a week as they are now. And so I got together the briefing for those questions from the departments and put that together as a brief, which the Prime Minister then studied in the mornings on which there were parliamentary questions. And the other part of it was drafting letters for the Prime Minister to sign in response to letters that came in. And we usually got drafts from departments, and then my job was to just make them more suitable to the style of Edward Heath, and then put them into him, and he would sign them. And so those were the two parts of the first job that I did in the.
And you were also, I believe, you've entered number 10, obviously, as one of the private secretaries to Ted Heath, but you also held the similar role for Harold Wilson as well.
I did.
And how did that differ? I mean, obviously, very different leadership styles from the two individuals, but presumably the constant was that you were doing very similar support to Harold Wilson that you were also doing to Ted Heath.
Yes, well, I should also explain that after I'd been doing the parliamentary work for 18 months or so, I was moved up to being the private secretary dealing with economic affairs. And so by the time Harold Wilson came in, I was doing that. And indeed, I've been doing it during the latter part of Ted Heath's prime ministership, which was when there was the traumatic experience of the coal miners' strike, which eventually, of course, brought Ted Heath down. And he called an election at the beginning of 1974, when he hadn't been able to reach a settlement with the miners, and lost the Conservative majority. Labour had 3 more seats from the Conservative, not an overall majority. And that's when Harold Wilson returned as Prime Minister, he having been Prime Minister before from 1964 to 1970. And he came back in 1974 in very, very traumatic circumstances, really, because there were huge demonstrations outside Downing Street, people chanting Heath out. Heath tried to form a coalition with the Liberals. He'd have fewer seats than Wilson, but only a few fewer. And if he managed to reach an agreement with the Liberal Party, then led by Jeremy Thorpe, they could have had a coalition. but those negotiations failed, and then Harold Wilson returned with a minority government.
And watching those changeovers and obviously appreciating the continuity that the civil service provided, I mean, how did that, your experiences of the two different prime ministers at that point, did it change your view of the civil service? Did it give you a new dimension as to how you saw the importance of the civil service in the machinery of government? Or were you, I mean, by that point, you'd obviously observed quite a lot already. I mean, I was just interested to get your feeling for the role of the civil service and its relationship with the government of the day, and obviously seen through the lens of your direct experience from working with two very different prime ministers.
Well, what it brought home was that the job of the civil service was to work committedly for whoever was the government that the electorate returned.
Yeah.
And as I say, that changeover in March of 1974 from Conservative to Labour was a very traumatic one. I'd been working during the period of the miners' strike, up to, it felt like 18 hours a day for Ted Heath, entirely committed to writing speeches for him, providing the arguments, negotiations with the TUC, negotiations with the NUM to try and bring about a settlement of the coal miners' strike on the terms which the Conservatives wanted to reach. And then the Labour were going to come in. And I thought, well, what's going to happen to us? I mean, we've been working so devotedly for Ted Heath. Will we all be thrown out? And Harold Wilson knew exactly what the system was. He'd been prime minister for 6 years previously. He'd been a wartime civil servant. So he knew that the civil service could be counted on to work as faithfully for him as we had for the Conservatives. And so he came in, he kept exactly the same civil service team in number 10, including the same principal private secretary. And we got on with the job as he wanted it to be done. And so, I mean, this was a traumatic personal experience because, I formed a great bond with Ted Heath. But I came to accept that the civil service worked for the opposite party just as well. And in some ways it was made easier because Harold Wilson had been at the college at Oxford where I was. He was a junior research fellow at the end of the war. And so we had personal links. There were still people who'd been there when I was an undergraduate. And so I found him very easy to get on with.
And you obviously cut your teeth in number 10 because you retained obviously that link, just moving forwards a little bit to become, obviously, as everybody knows, the principal private secretary to Margaret Thatcher in the 80s after she come into power, which is another, I would imagine, dimensional change in terms of the first female prime minister, very different style from the other two people that you were working with. But during your time, I would imagine, as principal private secretary to Margaret Thatcher, you also stood and witnessed some fairly seismic events from a global and national point of view happening as well, which must have been an interesting experience, which is probably a big understatement to say, being there and seeing all of that unfold in the role that you were fulfilling there.
Yes, I mean, the convention then was that the civil servants in number 10 did 3-year postings.
Yeah.
And so I worked for Heath and then Wilson between 72 and 75. I then went back to the Treasury and I did the job you referred to briefly earlier of working with outside consultants on introducing a computerized financial information system for the government.
Yeah.
And then, I thought my time in number 10 was over. And then I was summoned back to be interviewed by Margaret Thatcher in 1982 to be the principal private secretary.
How was that interview, Robin? I mean, that must have been quite an interesting one-to-one, I should imagine.
Well, this is where I do claim a little bit of integrity, because I said to Margaret Thatcher, well, I would love to have this job, but I do want to tell you that I very strongly believed in what Ted Heath was trying to do. He was trying to get the country working together. Now, that was a very dangerous thing to say, but by that time, Margaret Thatcher and Ted Heath were at loggerheads.
Yeah.
Anyway, Margaret Thatcher looked at me and she said, well, that's not what I've got against you. I said, well, what have you got against me? She said, well, when I was in the cabinet under Ted Heath, you came and made a presentation to the cabinet as part of Lord Rothschild's think tank, where you said that inflation was endemic to the economy and couldn't be eliminated, and therefore the job of the government was to protect people who were on fixed incomes, like pensioners and so on. And she said, she said to me, you said inflation was endemic. I have never heard such a shocking statement by a young man. Of course, inflation's not endemic. We can eliminate. She said, but since you were a young man, I've decided to forgive you. And if you want the job, I'll give it to you.
Well, presumably, I mean, that's great testimony to you, though. The fact that obviously, I mean, because she was, I mean, speaking from an outsider observing, she didn't suffer fools gladly, did she? Thatcher.
You certainly could say that. Again, I was lucky. I had an introduction to her because her husband, Dennis Thatcher, was a first-class rugby referee. And I had been refereed by him when I was playing for Richmond Rugby Club, and we shared a beer or two in the evenings. And so I think that's a sort of, I think he was supporting my appointment, so that helped me a lot.
I mean, we could spend an entire 60 Voices podcast just on your time with Mrs. Thatcher, but sadly we don't have the time to do it. But what sticks in your mind as like a particularly memorable moment or event that you always come back to when people, I'm sure lots of people have asked you this over the years, but from that time you were working with Margaret Thatcher, what if you were picking a particular event during that time that you thought, you know, that was either different or, you know, not anticipating that, what would it be?
Well, there were so many that I was privileged to be a witness to, but I suppose I've really got to say the Brighton bomb, because the Brighton bomb illustrated her characteristics that she had, which really, I think, were essential to her. The Brighton bomb, as many of your listeners will know, was at the set up by the PIRA, at the Grand Hotel Brighton during the Conservative Party.
I remember I was a young pupil at Brighton College, and we were actually at school the day that happened, the night that happened, because we heard the explosion go off in the early hours of the morning, and then obviously all hell broke loose in terms of what followed. But well, I was with her at the Conservative Party conference, not because I was taking part in the politics, but because there was government business to do, and the bomb was set off the night before the final day and her big speech. And these were always terrible moments because she worked through to the small hours. And she finished her speech at 2:30 in the morning. And the speechwriters went, and I was left alone in her sitting room with her. And there was one piece of paper on which the office wanted a decision by the next morning. And so I said to her, would you look at this overnight and tell me at breakfast what you want done? And she said, well, if you don't mind, I'll look at it now, and then I can forget about it and concentrate on my speech. So at the moment the bomb went off, she was sitting looking at this bit of paper. I was sitting in an armchair across the room from her. And then there was this huge explosion. And I thought, oh, my goodness, somebody's trying to blow up the Prime Minister, and I'm alone with her, and I better try and do something sensible. So I said to her, I think you ought to come away from the windows in case there's another bomb.
And she said, this is the first point I want to make about her, I must see if Dennis is all right.
Yeah.
He was in bed in the next door room, and she opened the door to the bedroom, and you could hear the sound of falling masonry through it. And I should have said to her, stand back, Prime Minister, this is a job for somebody more dispensable than you. But I didn't. And she went into the room. It was actually the bathroom that was collapsing. And a few moments later, she came out with Dennis pulling his grey flannels over his trousers. And so that was one moment. And the second moment was we were taken to Lewis Police Training College, and I was lay down in the day room where there was a television. She and Dennis were given beds, and the telephone rang, and it was John Gummer from the conference centre saying, it's much worse than we thought, and this Norman Tebbit and John Wakeham have been buried in the rubble, and they're still digging for them, and the television cameras are here, and so you can see what's happening. So I turned on the television and saw Norman Tebbit being brought out very badly injured, and they were still digging for John Wakeham. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, Margaret Thatcher came out. She was dressed with clothes that I'd rescued from her room. And I said to her, I think things are very bad. There's already 5 people being killed, and Norman Tebbit's been very badly injured, and John Wakeham hasn't even been retrieved. And she didn't hesitate for a moment, and she said, well, it's now 8 o'clock, and the conference must start on time at 9:30. And I couldn't believe it. I said to you, you're not going to go on with a party political event when some of your closest colleagues have been killed and injured. And she said, and of course I'll never forget it, this is our moment to show that terrorism can't defeat democracy. And of course she was right, and I was wrong. But the point about it is that on those two first reactions, you saw a politician reacting instinctively to something they couldn't possibly have been prepared for. One was, I must see if my husband's all right. And the other was, well, we must now take this opportunity to show that terrorism can't disrupt what we're trying to do.
That's a very interesting observation, and thank you for sharing. I could spend another 60 minutes talking to you just about that time you were in number 10 with Mrs. Thatcher, but you finished the private secretary, I think, 1985, is that right?
Correct.
And what happened, and then you obviously, we'll come on to the cabinet secretary, head of the Home Civil Service in a moment, but what happened in between you finishing the role of principal private secretary for Mrs. Thatcher and when you became the cabinet secretary and head of the Home Civil Service? Did you go back to Treasury, or?
I went back to the Treasury, and for the second time in my life, I thought, well, that's the end of all that, and the rest of my career will be in the Treasury. And so I was then put in charge as second permanent secretary of public expenditure, and I did that from 85 to 88. And then Margaret Thatcher appointed me cabinet secretary.
So just for those people who are listening who might not know the structure of the civil service, can you explain? And I mean, I obviously worked for the CSRF for nearly 17 years and obviously have learned an awful lot in that time about the civil service. But there is a duality in the role that you held. You've obviously got the role of cabinet secretary, but then you also had the very distinct role of head of the Home Civil Service. And how did those two interlink? I mean, you presumably had two hats on at any given moment in time in terms of your role and responsibility. But for those people who probably don't know, could you explain a bit more about the two roles and how they join together?
Well, of course, they can be separate roles, and they have been from time to time.
Yeah,
there have been occasions when the cabinet secretary hasn't been head of the civil service, and the head of the civil service has been another permanent secretary.
I think they had that, didn't they, with Jeremy Hayward and Bob Kerslake split the role temporarily, didn't they, for a period?
They did. But it didn't. In my view, the separation doesn't work, and it doesn't work for this reason. Mm-hmm. There have been times when the head of the civil service, was Ian Bancroft at one time, and he wasn't the cabinet secretary. But prime ministers don't have all that time or possibly appetite to be head of the civil service. They've got things that absorb their time more. And if the civil service is going to get some attention from the Prime Minister, it's best done if the head of the civil service is the cabinet secretary, because you've got to spend a lot of time with the Prime Minister. And so I could bring issues affecting the civil service to the attention of the Prime Minister that I couldn't have done had I not been cabinet secretary. And I think, as I say, attempts have been made to separate them, but I think experience has always shown that it works best if the two roles are combined.
And am I right in thinking the choice of the word home in that refers to the civil service in England, Wales, and Scotland? Is that right, or is it just Wales?
No. It's because the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the FCO, the Foreign Office, were very insistent on their individuality and separation.
Ah, okay, right.
So they did not like the term head of the civil service because they wanted to emphasize that it was
they were responsible for international matters.
Exactly.
Yeah. That I've learned something new, because when I first joined the CSRF, I'm sure someone said to me, "Oh, it just refers to England and England and Wales, but it means like the homeland." But you've now, obviously, it makes a lot more sense, the explanation you've correctly given me. So I've learned something new after being 17 years working for the CSRF. So thank you very much for that.
Because you see, I mean, as I explained earlier on, recruitment to the Foreign Service, the Foreign Office, was quite separate. On recruitment to the Home Civil Service. They always wanted to be independent.
Yeah, and probably still do, I should imagine, to a certain degree. So, do you remember the interview for were you given the job, or did you have an interview before you were appointed cabinet?
No, I didn't. I mean, because I knew Margaret Thatcher so well, she knew all about me.
Yeah.
I got a phone call in the morning, one morning, from Charles Powell, who was her Foreign Affairs Private Secretary at Number 10, saying, "Can you come in and see the Prime Minister at 9 o'clock?" And so you didn't have to be a genius, since I knew Robert Armstrong was retiring, to guess why I was being called in.
And you obviously held that role for a decade. I mean, so I think it's almost 88 to 98, and during which time, obviously, you saw the departure of Mr. Thatcher, because I think it was 89, wasn't it? 88, 89, she left.
It was
89. And then obviously you would presumably have then had experience of working with John Major, and then obviously Tony Blair with the landslide that the Labour Party won in the 90s. I mean, how you were the continuity for all those three changes, I guess, throughout all of the material of what the political colours were of the government of the day. The continuity factor was almost you, because you were, you had the foresight and the understanding and the knowledge of what had been doing and how things were running and all of that. So you were an integral cog, I should imagine.
Well, no, the continuity was the civil service as a whole.
Yeah.
All my permanent secretaries and I, and there is this convention, as you'll know, that in the lead up to a general election, the Prime Minister of the day authorizes the permanent secretaries to have confidential talks with the opposition spokesman, so that the civil service can be prepared for a transition if it should happen. And so that happened in the lead up to, it happened in the lead up to 92, when the Conservatives rather unexpectedly retained power. And it happened in the lead up to 1997, when Labour won the election and Tony Blair came in.
And in terms of those briefings and those preparations, I mean, what were any great surprises that came to you when you were involved in those, when the governments were changing? Or I'm sure you're far too diplomatic to be too indiscreet about that, but at the same time, it's fascinating to have seen such an arc of political change from where you were sat.
Well, there are always surprises, because when it comes to making appointments, the Prime Minister has to, form a cabinet, and things sometimes go wrong, and so the people who have been the shadow spokesman the lead up to the election don't necessarily get the job that the Secretary of State job when they come in.
Yeah.
And so it's as much of a surprise to them as it is to the civil servants, the permanent secretaries that they've been dealing with. And so, there are very often surprises of that sort about appointments, and people have to start really from scratch, and the civil service helps them to do it after an election.
And again, picking a particular moment in the time that you were Cabinet Secretary and Home Civil Service, bearing in mind that you spanned 3 prime ministers in that role, if you were going to pick a particularly seismic or memorable moment or thing that's always stuck in your mind for the decade that you were in that role, what would it pick? Give me an anecdote from your time as Cabinet Secretary. Pick one. You've probably got many, which you should put in a book, I should hasten to add.
Well, I suppose the most memorable was the transition from Conservative to Labour in 1997.
Yeah.
Because Labour hadn't been in office for the last 18 years, and there was only one person, Jack Cunningham, who'd been a minister before, so they were all completely new to it.
Yeah.
And as always happens, understandably, politicians are very ideological and political, and they often find it difficult to understand that civil servants aren't. I mean, civil servants are pragmatic and politically neutral, though they may have their own private views. So you always have to sort of build trust that they've seen you working for their predecessors, for the opposite party. So you've got to build trust with them. And that transition, in particular, it was a big transition from Major to Blair, and quite a different relationship with the media, and the media were becoming much more prominent and intrusive in government affairs. And so that was a big change, and particularly the Government Information Service weren't really attuned to the speed at which New Labour wanted to do things. And so the civil service, particularly the information service, had to adapt to that. But the transition went well, and I've still got, I treasure a minute from Tony Blair, a personal minute to me, thanking me for what the civil service had done and for the way in which the transition had been managed.
Excellent. Now, we're obviously coming up to the top of the hour. Have you got I've got 3 more questions I'd like to ask. Have you got time to do that, or are you on the clock?
I've got time if I'll answer them briefly.
Okay, that's fine. The first of it is an observation. Again, correct me if it's incorrectly credited to you, but you've observed that the UK civil service is potentially at risk of adopting a US style model of political appointments, I think, according to some of the research. And I wondered how you felt about the essential element of maintaining a politically neutral and stable civil service as being essential to good governance.
Well, there have been a lot more recently of people top appointments have been changed by incoming governments or incoming ministers. And so that does then make the British civil service, instead of being continuous, permanent, providing continuity and experience, more like the American system, where people at the top of the service change when the president changes. And I think that's regrettable, because I think, the civil service has got a strong tradition and professional obligation to behave and to provide competent and experienced government to whoever happens to be the minister of the day.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We're going to move quickly to retirement. Obviously, we are all about retirement. We were formed to provide a forum for people once they've retired from the civil service. And your retirement career, which is obviously still active because you're in the House of Lords, has included quite a variety of different roles after you left the civil service. Obviously, the Master of University College Oxford, you obviously were involved with HSBC Group and Royal Academy of Music. And I suppose my question for you, based on the civil service angle, is how your civil service background helped inform your leadership in these new sectors that you were going into after you'd retired from the civil service?
Well, I must correct you on one thing.
Go on.
I'm afraid I'm not musical. I've never
Oh,
had
okay.
with the Royal Academy of
Okay,
Music.
that's fine. I will shoot my researcher.
I think you may be thinking of Robert Armstrong
Okay, no problem.
in that respect. But anyway, well, I can tell you that becoming running an Oxford College with a group of academics who are the fellowship of the college was far more difficult than running the permanent secretaries of the civil service. But running the permanent secretaries was very good experience, very good preparation for it. And my wife used to say, now don't get worked up if you're finding difficulties with the fellows in the college. They need you more than you need them, and they're like sharks. Don't let them see blood in the water. So anyway, it was very good protection, preparation for being head of an Oxford College.
Excellent. That's a good answer, Robin. And very lastly, and thank you again for your time, I just wondered, looking back on the whole of your career, what personal qualities or values do you think are most essential in a successful civil servant based on your own career?
Well, I think professionalism. I think a wish to serve the country, a willingness to respect democracy and to work for whoever the electorate have returned, and to do that to the best of one's ability, and also to develop the skills which are necessary in a world which is always changing and developing.
And on that note, that's a very good note to finish. If you just hold fire for a moment, I'm just going to do our closing remark. But before I do, I just wanted to say a huge, huge thank you to you for giving us an hour of your busy schedule. And it's been absolutely fascinating. And I could spend another 4 to 5 hours talking about all aspects of. We've only very briefly touched on an amazing civil service career. But if you, the listeners, have enjoyed listening to this episode, you can check out all of our other episodes on the CSRF's YouTube channel. You can find out more about the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship via our website, which has full details of the charitable services we provide, how you might want to volunteer or donate to our Diamond Anniversary Appeal. And if you'd be interested in being a guest on a future episode, we'd love to hear from you. But until the next time, thank you to Robin Butler for his time. And goodbye for now, and we will look forward to catching up with you on a future episode.
Thank you, Dave.
The CSRF, the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship, is a charity set up for civil servants by civil servants. In 1960, Douglas Houghton MP highlighted the need for an organisation that supported retired civil servants offering friendship and companionship. 59 years later, we are still carrying on his dream. You can find out more about the CSRF at our website, www.csrf.org.uk. Why not sign up to become a digital donor for £3, less than the price of coffee? Or you may wish to volunteer. Contact us via the website.